The shot that changed everything. The night was calm, the sky a deep indigo speckled with stars. The only sounds in the gated neighborhood were the distant chirps of crickets and the occasional rustling of trees. It was a picture of suburban peace, until the gunshot rang out. Officer Bradley Porter stood frozen, his hands gripping his service weapon so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribcage, drowning out every other sound. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood that pooled on the pristine lawn before him. A boy lay motionless on the ground. The basketball he had been holding had rolled a few feet away, its orange surface smeared with dirt. His wide, unblinking eyes stared up at the sky, as if searching for answers in the stars. For a few moments, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. And then, porch lights flickered on, one by one, as curious neighbors peeked through their curtains, their faces barely visible behind the safety of glass. Bradley's breath came in short gasps. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He hadn't meant to shoot. It was supposed to be a warning shot. The kid had run. Why had he run? The distant wail of sirens pulled him out of his haze. He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. This wasn't going to end like every other shooting incident, where the badge shielded him. Not this time. A sleek black sedan screeched to a halt at the end of the street. The door flung open, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. His presence was commanding, his movements filled with purpose and urgency. Judge Marcus Wright. Bradley felt the weight of the moment crush down on him. He had seen Judge Wright's face on television, in courtrooms, in newspaper headlines. The man was known for his ironclad rulings, his relentless pursuit of justice. But at this moment, he wasn't a judge. He was a father. Judge Wright's eyes scanned the scene, his gaze landing on the lifeless form sprawled on the grass. For a fraction of a second, confusion flickered across his features. Then horror. No. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the night like a gut-wrenching wail. He sprinted toward the boy, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the damp grass. He hesitated for a moment, his trembling hands hovering above the child's body, as if touching him would confirm the worst. His fingers finally made contact, brushing against the boy's cheek, still warm. "Jeremiah." His voice cracked. "No, no, no." A broken sob tore from his throat. The night swallowed it whole, but the weight of his grief was undeniable. Bradley took a step back. His gut twisted as realization hit him like a freight train. He had just shot the son of one of the most powerful judges in the state. The sirens were deafening now. Red and blue lights painted the pristine neighborhood in chaotic flashes. Police cruisers screeched to a halt, doors flying open as officers rushed out. A crowd had gathered, neighbors, onlookers, people with their phones out recording. Judge Wright slowly turned his tear-streaked face toward Bradley. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something dangerous. "You'll pay for this," he whispered, his voice thick with a promise. The word sent an icy chill down Bradley's spine. Earlier that day, the day had started like any other for Officer Bradley Porter. He sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee while mindlessly scrolling through his phone. It was a routine evening shift, one he had done countless times before. At 6:45 p.m., the call came in. "Suspicious individual in the Greystone-gated community," the dispatcher reported. "Young black male, wearing a hoodie, possibly trespassing." Bradley barely raised an eyebrow. These calls were common, routine. He had responded to dozens of them. They'd never amounted to anything serious. "Copy that," he replied, placing his coffee down and shifting the car into gear. Jeremiah Wright, a boy with dreams. 13-year-old Jeremiah Wright wasn't trespassing. He had been playing basketball at the community court with a few of his friends, the way he did most evenings. The laughter, the playful jabs, the friendly competition. It was his favorite part of the day. When the ball bounced over the fence and rolled onto one of the pristine neighborhood lawns. Jeremiah didn't think twice before chasing after it. He jogged toward the ball, bent down to pick it up, and turned to head back. That's when he saw the police cruiser pull up. The flashing lights made his stomach tighten. His father had given him the talk more times than he could count. Be respectful. Don't make sudden movements. Keep your hands visible. But in that moment, all those lessons blurred together in a haze of fear. The officer stepped out, one hand resting on his holstered gun. "Hey, stop right there." The command was sharp, forceful. Jeremiah froze. His grip tightened around the basketball. His mind raced. What had he done wrong? "I was just." "Hands up," the officer barked, cutting him off. Jeremiah hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest. He lifted his hands slowly, his palms open. He wanted to explain, but his throat was dry. Bradley's eyes flicked over the boy. The hoodie, the slight hesitation, the tension in his stance. His own adrenaline spiked. Something felt off. Jeremiah shifted slightly, taking a step back, just one. A small, instinctive movement. Bradley's hand shot to his weapon. "I said stop." Panic overtook Jeremiah. He did the only thing his young brain could think of. He ran. Bradley didn't think. He reacted. The gun fired. And in an instant, the world changed forever. The aftermath. Back at the Wright household, Marcus had been reviewing case files in his study. His wife, Helena, was cooking dinner, and their daughter, Maya, was upstairs on the phone with her friends. It was a normal evening. Then the call came. A neighbor, their voice shaking, had stammered, "Judge Wright, something happened near the basketball court. Your son." The rest of the words were a blur. Marcus had driven like a madman, speeding through the streets, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Nothing could have prepared him for what he found. Now, as the paramedics loaded Jeremiah's small, lifeless body onto a stretcher, the weight of it all came crashing down. The police chief arrived, his face pale as he surveyed the scene. Officers were already pulling Bradley aside, whispering urgent instructions. "Keep quiet. We'll sort this out." But there would be no sorting this out. Not this time. Judge Wright rose to his feet, his body trembling, his fists clenched. His grief had morphed into something else, something sharper. "You'll face me in court, Officer Porter," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "And I will make sure you never forget my son's name." Bradley felt his knees buckle. His badge had protected him before. But this time, there would be no shield. This time, justice was coming. The weight of the badge. The world around Officer Bradley Porter felt like it was caving in. The cold, sterile walls of the police station had never felt so suffocating before. He sat in the holding room, his hands clasped tightly together, his fingers twitching against each other. The weight of his uniform felt unbearable, like a chain tightening around his body with every breath he took. He had been in this station hundreds of times before. He had walked these halls with authority, wearing his badge like a shield. But tonight, he was not the officer in control. He was the suspect. The door creaked open. Captain Stevens stepped in, his face set in a deep frown. His usual confident stride was slower, heavier. He looked at Bradley for a long moment before finally speaking. "Bradley," he said, pulling out the chair across from him. His voice was grim, measured. "This is bad. Real bad." Bradley swallowed hard but said nothing. What could he say? That it had been a mistake. That he hadn't meant to pull the trigger. That he had thought the boy was a threat. None of that mattered anymore. He had shot a child. And not just any child. The son of Judge Marcus Wright. Stevens leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Do you have any idea what's happening out there right now?" He gestured toward the small television in the corner of the room. The screen flickered with live coverage from outside the station. Protesters filled the streets, their voices echoing into the night. "Justice for Jeremiah. Stop killing our children." No badge should protect a murderer. The words cut through Bradley like a blade. You're all over the news, Stevens continued. The judge is pressing charges. The media is calling this an execution, and people want your head on a platter. Bradley clenched his fists. It was an accident, he muttered. I didn't know he was the judge's son. I was responding to a trespassing call. The kid ran. I thought. You thought what? Stevens cut him off, his voice sharp. That a 13-year-old with a basketball was a threat. That a child running away justified pulling the trigger. Bradley's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. Because deep down, even he knew the truth. A father's wrath. Across town, in the quiet luxury of the Wright household, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with grief. The weight of loss pressed against every wall. Helena Wright sat on the couch, Jeremiah's hoodie clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The house was eerily silent, except for the muffled sound of Maya sobbing in her room upstairs. Every now and then, the distant echoes of protesters outside reached them, their cries for justice filling the void left by Jeremiah's absence. Marcus stood near the fireplace, his hands gripping the mantel. His face was blank, but his eyes burned with an intensity that no one dared question. His son was dead, killed in cold blood, and the man who had pulled the trigger was still breathing. Helena's voice broke the silence. Marcus. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He was just a boy. Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment. I know. He had so many dreams, she continued, her voice cracking. He wanted to be an engineer. He had his whole life ahead of him. And now he's just gone. Marcus turned to face her, his jaw tightening. He had spent years in courtrooms, fighting for justice, delivering verdicts with unwavering conviction. But this was different. This wasn't just a case. This was his son. Helena looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of desperate grief. You have to make him pay, Marcus. He killed our baby. Marcus knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. I will, he said, his voice low, steady. I promise you, Helena. Officer Bradley Porter will face justice. He will not walk away from this. There was no hesitation in his voice. Only certainty. Only wrath. The city erupts. By morning, the news of Jeremiah Wright's killing had spread like wildfire. Every major news outlet ran the story. Social media exploded with outrage. Another unarmed black boy killed by police. Justice for Jeremiah. How many more children have to die before something changes? Protests erupted outside the police station. Hundreds of people gathered, their signs raised high, their voices carrying the pain of a community that had seen this tragedy play out too many times before. Say his name. Jeremiah Wright. Inside the station, Bradley sat in his cell, his head in his hands. The noise from the protesters outside was relentless. He could hear them chanting his name spoken with fury, with venom. He was no longer Officer Porter. He was a murderer. A deputy approached his cell, unlocking the door with a heavy sigh. It's time, he muttered. Your arraignment is in an hour. Bradley's stomach churned. It was really happening. The courtroom. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras flashing. The tension in the air was thick, electric. Bradley sat at the defense table, his hands resting in his lap. His lawyer, Peter Lawson, sat beside him, flipping through a folder with a grim expression. Across the room, Marcus Wright sat with his wife and daughter. Helena's eyes were red and swollen, but her posture was firm. Maya clutched her mother's hand, her expression hardened by grief. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. All rise. Bradley stood, his legs shaking slightly. The judge took her seat, adjusting her glasses before looking down at the papers in front of her. Officer Bradley Porter, you are charged with second-degree murder and reckless endangerment in the shooting death of Jeremiah Wright. How do you plead? Bradley swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His gaze locked onto Bradley with an intensity that could have set the entire room ablaze. The judge nodded. "Very well. Bail will be determined following arguments." Sarah Green, the lead prosecutor, stood. She was sharp, composed. "Your Honor, the defendant shot an unarmed child. He was not in immediate danger. There is clear evidence of excessive force and misconduct. We request that bail be denied." Peter Lawson stood next. "Your Honor, Officer Porter has no prior convictions. He is not a flight risk. He has served this community for years. We ask that bail be set at a reasonable amount." The judge studied both sides for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Given the severity of the charges, bail is set at $500,000. A hushed gasp filled the room. Bradley's heart sank. He was going to jail. The March for Justice. That evening, thousands of people gathered in the streets. The protest had grown into a march, stretching for blocks, a wave of voices demanding change. Marcus stood on a platform, a microphone in hand. The city was watching. The world was watching. "My son should be here today," he said, his voice steady, commanding. "He should be home, laughing with his sister. He should be playing basketball with his friends. But he's not." The crowd listened in silence. "Why?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "Because an officer saw him as a threat. Because he was a black boy in a hoodie. Because in this country, my son's skin made him a suspect before he even opened his mouth." The crowd erupted in agreement. "No more," Marcus roared. "We will not stop. We will not be silent. We demand justice." The chant grew deafening. "Justice for Jeremiah. Justice for Jeremiah." As Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about his son. This was a movement. And they would not stop until justice was served. A system on trial. The awakening of a nation. The city of Greystone was unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet, affluent suburb had now become the epicenter of a national reckoning. The shooting of Jeremiah Wright had ignited something much larger than a single case. It had set fire to the collective outrage of a people long ignored. Tens of thousands marched through the streets, their voices shaking the very foundation of a system that had failed them for too long. Signs bearing Jeremiah's name were held high. Murals of his smiling face had been painted on city walls, his story now a symbol for something far greater. On the courthouse steps, Judge Marcus Wright stood with his wife Helena and their daughter Maya. He looked out at the sea of protesters, at the news cameras broadcasting every moment to millions of viewers. "This fight is bigger than my son," he said into the microphone. His voice, though exhausted, carried the weight of an unyielding determination. "This fight is for every family who has lost a child to an unjust system. This fight is for every black child who has been told that their very existence is a threat." The crowd roared in agreement. Helena stepped forward next, her hand shaking as she gripped the microphone. "I don't want Jeremiah to be just another name," she said, her voice cracking. "I want my baby's name to mean something. I want his name to change this country." Maya wiped away tears as she clutched her mother's arm. She had never imagined standing in front of so many people, speaking out for her brother. But here she was. "I miss my brother," she whispered, "and I won't stop until his name means something." The crowd erupted into chants. "Say his name. Jeremiah Wright." The courtroom battle begins. Inside the courthouse, the tension was suffocating. Officer Bradley Porter sat at the defense table, his face drained of color. His once pristine uniform was gone, replaced by a suit that did little to mask his unease. His hands trembled as he adjusted his tie, his pulse hammering in his ears. Across from him, Judge Wright sat at the prosecution table beside Sarah Green, the state's lead attorney. His face was unreadable, a mask of control hiding the storm raging beneath. But his hands, clenched into fists, betrayed the rage he held inside. The bailiff's voice cut through the air. "All rise." The judge entered the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Bradley. She wasted no time. "We are here to determine whether Officer Bradley Porter's actions on the night of Jeremiah Wright's death constitute second-degree murder and reckless endangerment," she announced. "The prosecution may begin." Sarah Green stood. She was calm, confident, a woman who had spent years dismantling men who thought they were untouchable. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the jury, "this case is not complicated. A 13-year-old boy, unarmed and afraid, was shot in the back by a police officer. That officer, instead of following his training, instead of de-escalating the situation, chose to use deadly force on a child." She turned toward Bradley, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "The defense will tell you this was a mistake. That Officer Porter acted out of fear. But I ask you, what was there to fear? A basketball? A hoodie? The color of Jeremiah Wright's skin?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. "This case is not just about Bradley Porter. It is about a system that allows officers like him to act without consequence. Today, we decide if Jeremiah Wright's life mattered." She returned to her seat. Peter Lawson, Bradley's defense attorney, stood next. He was a seasoned lawyer, known for getting police officers acquitted. But today, he knew the fight ahead of him was unlike any other. Officer Porter was responding to a call about a suspicious person. Lawson said, "He made a split-second decision. Was it a tragic mistake? Yes. But that does not make it murder." He gestured toward Bradley. "My client is not a racist. He is not a monster. He is a man who made a terrible choice in a moment of fear. And I ask you to remember that before casting judgment." Bradley exhaled slowly. He could only hope the jury believed it. The evidence that could change everything. The prosecution wasted no time building its case. They called witnesses, neighbors who had seen the shooting from their windows, friends of Jeremiah, who had been playing basketball with him moments before. Then they played the body camera footage. The entire courtroom held its breath as the grainy video played on the large screen. "Hey, stop right there." Jeremiah froze, holding his basketball. "I was just..." "Hands up." Bradley's voice was sharp, aggressive. Jeremiah lifted his hands. The camera caught the slight tremble in them. Then he took a step back, and Bradley pulled his gun. "I said stop." The boy turned to run. The gun fired. Jeremiah collapsed onto the pavement. The footage ended. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Helena Wright covered her face, muffling a sob. Marcus clenched his jaw, his fingers digging into the edge of the table. Sarah turned to the jury. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "where in this video do you see a threat?" The jury remained silent. Bradley kept his gaze down, shame burning through him. A damning revelation. Just when it seemed the case couldn't get worse for the defense, the prosecution dropped a bombshell. "We have obtained additional security footage from the neighborhood," Sarah Green announced. Footage that the police department attempted to suppress. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Proceed." The courtroom screen lit up again. A different angle. A security camera from a nearby house. This time, the footage showed something even more damning. Jeremiah was already outside the property line when Bradley arrived. His hands were up. He had turned to leave. Then the shot rang out. Sarah turned to the jury. The police department altered the original footage to protect Officer Porter. But the truth is here. Jeremiah Wright was no threat. This was not a mistake. She turned to Bradley. This was murder. The defense crumbles. Peter Lawson knew it was over. He had defended dozens of officers before, spinning narratives of fear and self-defense. But this was indefensible. Still, he had to try. He called Bradley to the stand. The officer sat stiffly, his hands gripping the wooden railing in front of him. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said. I thought he might have had a weapon." Sarah stood for cross-examination. "Did you see a weapon, Officer Porter?" "No," he admitted. Sarah's voice grew sharper. "Did you give him time to comply before pulling your gun?" Bradley hesitated. I don't know." Sarah leaned forward. "You don't know, or you didn't care?" Bradley's face burned. He had no answers, because there were none. A verdict approaches. As the trial neared its conclusion, the world outside the courtroom braced for the verdict. The protests had only grown. National leaders had weighed in. The case had become a flashpoint for racial justice, and now it all rested in the hands of 12 jurors. Marcus sat in his study that night, staring at the last photo he had taken of Jeremiah. His son's bright smile, his shining eyes. "This is for you," he whispered. "For Jeremiah. For every child like him." Justice was coming. The trial of a nation. A city on the brink. Greystone was unrecognizable. The once quiet, privileged suburb had transformed into a city under siege. National Guard troops patrolled the streets. Protesters filled every major intersection, their chants echoing across neighborhoods that had once turned a blind eye to injustice. The trial of Officer Bradley Porter wasn't just about Jeremiah Wright anymore. It had become a reckoning for an entire system. News anchors reported from the courthouse steps, their voices tense as they relayed updates. The nation waits as the most controversial trial in decades unfolds. Will justice be served, or will another officer walk free? Tensions were razor sharp. The world had seen the body cam footage. They had watched Jeremiah Wright, a scared 13-year-old boy, raise his hands and surrender before turning to run. They had seen Officer Porter pull the trigger. The jury was deliberating. The city held its breath. And Marcus Wright, he was preparing for the moment that would define his life. Inside the courthouse, the courtroom was a battlefield. Every day of the trial had felt like a war, and Marcus Wright was determined to win it. He sat at the prosecution table, his fingers clenched together. On the opposite side, Bradley Porter looked smaller than ever. The former officer's face was gaunt, his suit hanging loosely on his frame. His entire world had crumbled in a matter of weeks. At the defense table, Peter Lawson shuffled through his notes, but the fight had drained from his posture. The prosecution had shredded every argument he had. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was undeniable. The judge entered, and the tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud. "All rise." Everyone obeyed. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. No one knew what their decision would be. Not yet. The judge turned to the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A pause. Then the foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom seemed to shrink. "In the case of second-degree murder, we find the defendant." The world stopped. The trial within a trial. 4 weeks earlier, when the trial had just begun, Marcus had felt something shift inside him. He had spent years serving the very system that had now failed him. He had upheld the law. He had believed in justice. But now, as he fought for his son, he realized the truth. The system was never built for people like Jeremiah. That's why, before the trial had even started, Marcus had decided he wasn't just fighting for a conviction. He was fighting to dismantle the machine that had allowed Bradley Porter to exist in the first place. From the moment the trial began, Sarah Green had constructed a case that went beyond one police officer. They didn't just show the jury the video footage. They introduced Bradley Porter's disciplinary record, a record littered with complaints, all buried under bureaucratic indifference. They brought forward former colleagues, officers who had seen Porter abuse his power, officers who had tried to report him and had been silenced. And then they played the 911 call that had set everything in motion. The neighbor's voice filled the courtroom speakers. "There's a black kid in the neighborhood. He looks suspicious. I don't know. He's wearing a hoodie. He's near the basketball court, but I don't think he belongs here." The voice cracked under its own prejudice. The words painted a picture that was sickeningly familiar. It was never about a crime. It was never about danger. It was about Jeremiah's existence being enough to warrant suspicion. The breaking point. At home, Maya Wright had been struggling. She was barely sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her brother. Every time she opened her phone, she saw his face on protest signs, his name on social media posts. Some people fought for him. Others slandered him. "They're calling him a thug, Mom," she whispered one night, curled up on the couch beside Helena. "They're saying he should have listened, that he should have known better." Helena pulled her daughter close. "Don't listen to them." "How can I not?" Maya's voice broke. "He did everything right, Mom. He did everything right. And they're still saying it's his fault." Helena closed her eyes, fighting the anger rising in her chest. She had spent the last few weeks feeling like she was drowning in grief, in rage, in exhaustion. But when she looked at her daughter, she knew she had no choice. She had to keep fighting. For Jeremiah. For Maya. For every black mother who had ever feared that her child wouldn't come home. Bradley Porter's reckoning. In his jail cell, Bradley Porter sat alone. He hadn't been granted bail. He had spent weeks in a facility where the very people he had once arrested now walked past his cell, watching. He wasn't a cop anymore. He wasn't protected anymore. He was just another inmate. The first few days, he had tried to convince himself that he wasn't a bad man, that he had simply made a mistake, that he hadn't pulled the trigger out of hate. But the more he replayed that night in his mind, the more he realized something. It didn't matter that he hadn't hated Jeremiah Wright, because he had feared him. And that fear had killed a child. For the first time in his life, Bradley Porter felt the crushing weight of what it meant to be guilty. The verdict. Back in the courtroom, the entire world held its breath. The foreman gripped the paper. "In the case of second-degree murder, we find the defendant." Bradley Porter shut his eyes. "Guilty." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Helena collapsed into silent sobs. Marcus closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Bradley barely moved. It was over. For the first time in Greystone's history, a police officer had been convicted for taking a black life. But outside the courthouse, the fight wasn't over. People celebrated in the streets. Others raged. The police union called it an injustice. The Wright family called it a step forward. The city had changed. But would the system? The aftermath. A week after the verdict, Marcus stood before Congress. The nation watched as he testified, his voice steady but filled with grief. "This isn't just about my son," he said. "This is about every black child who has been feared instead of protected. This is about a system that allows officers to kill without consequence." He paused, his hands tightening into fists. "This cannot happen again." His words sparked something, a national conversation, a push for legislative change. It wouldn't bring Jeremiah back. But maybe, just maybe, it would stop another father from burying his son. Final moments. Late at night, Marcus sat alone in his study. On his desk was a single basketball. Jeremiah's basketball. He ran his fingers over its worn surface, closing his eyes. "I miss you, son," he whispered. "But I promise, they'll never forget your name." And outside, in cities across the country, thousands of voices chanted as one. Justice for Jeremiah. The cost of justice. A nation in turmoil. The guilty verdict of Officer Bradley Porter sent shockwaves through the country. For some, it was a victory, a long overdue reckoning for a system that had failed too many families like the Wrights. Across cities, people gathered in the streets, chanting Jeremiah Wright's name, carrying signs that read "Justice for Jeremiah," and "No more stolen lives." But for others, it was a betrayal. Police unions called it a dangerous precedent, a sign that officers could now be punished for doing their jobs. Right-wing news channels painted Porter as a victim of political correctness, arguing that he had been sacrificed to appease the mobs. In Greystone, the fallout was immediate. A week after the verdict, the police department staged a walkout. Dozens of officers resigned in protest, their absence leaving the department short-staffed. Some called it a blue flu, a silent protest by law enforcement who believed Porter had been unfairly convicted. Others called it what it was: retaliation. And in the Wright household, the weight of it all was suffocating. The heavy crown of victory. Marcus Wright had spent years delivering justice from the judge's bench. But now, justice had a cost. His family lived under constant threat. Death threats flooded their emails, their phone lines. Anonymous messages whispered of revenge. Graffiti had appeared on their front lawn, red spray paint spelling out "traitor" across their driveway. Security had to be tightened. Armed guards were posted outside their home. The local police department, what was left of it, refused to offer protection. The very system Marcus had spent his life upholding was turning its back on him. But Marcus refused to let fear stop him. One evening, as he sat in his study, Helena walked in, closing the door behind her. She looked exhausted. They all did. "We need to get out of here," she said softly. "At least for a while. The girls are terrified." "I'm terrified." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temple. "If we leave, what message does that send?" "That we care more about our family's safety than proving a point," she said, her voice shaking. "Marcus, they're calling you a traitor. They're saying you turned on the police. We don't know what these people are capable of." He looked at her, really looked at her. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear beneath her strength. She had stood by him through everything. Through the protests, the trial, the late nights planning their next move. But now, he realized, she was reaching her breaking point. And so was Maya. That night, Marcus found her sitting on the front porch, her knees tucked to her chest. She had her headphones in, but she wasn't listening to music. She was just staring at the sky. He sat down beside her. She didn't look at him. "Are we going to die?" she asked, her voice small. Marcus felt like someone had punched him in the chest. "No, baby," he said. "How do you know?" she whispered. He hesitated. Because the truth was, he didn't know. The backlash. The night of the verdict, the city of Greystone had exploded in protests and celebrations. But as the days passed, the mood turned dark. Counter-protests formed, led by angry groups who believed Bradley Porter had been sacrificed to satisfy public outrage. The police union released a statement. "This verdict is an attack on law enforcement. Officers now know that if they do their jobs, they will be prosecuted. The justice system has failed us." A former police captain appeared on national television, warning that morale in departments across the country was at an all-time low. How can we expect officers to do their jobs when they know they'll be thrown in prison for making a mistake? Marcus watched it all unfold, his hands clenched into fists. A mistake. That's what they were calling Jeremiah's death. Like it had been an accident. Like his son's life had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Bradley Porter speaks. Sitting in his prison cell, Bradley Porter watched the fallout from the verdict on a small TV mounted in the common area. He saw officers marching in his name, holding signs that read, "Free Officer Porter." He saw news commentators debating whether or not his conviction had been justified. And he hated all of it. Because he knew the truth. He had pulled the trigger. He had killed a child. And he could no longer tell himself that it had been an accident. The body cam footage had been played too many times for him to ignore it. He had seen himself, his hand tightening around the gun, his voice full of aggression, his mind already convinced that Jeremiah Wright was a threat. Jeremiah hadn't been a threat. But he had feared him anyway. And that fear had been enough to kill him. One evening, his lawyer came to visit. Peter Lawson looked worse than usual, his hair unkempt, his suit wrinkled. "You have a choice," Lawson said, sliding a document across the table. Bradley looked at it. A formal appeal request. If we push for it, we might be able to get your sentence reduced, Lawson continued. There's enough political pressure that we might be able to argue that the jury was biased. Bradley stared at the paper. A few weeks ago, he would have signed it without hesitation. But now he wasn't so sure. What if I don't appeal? He asked. Lawson blinked. Then you'll serve the full sentence. Bradley exhaled. Maybe I should. Lawson frowned. What? Bradley looked him in the eye. Maybe I should pay for what I did. For the first time since the trial began, he felt something close to peace. The legacy of Jeremiah Wright. Months passed. The world moved on. The media frenzy surrounding the trial faded. The protests became smaller. Other stories took over the news cycle. But the fight wasn't over. Marcus Wright had started something bigger than he had ever imagined. The Jeremiah Wright Foundation was born, a movement dedicated to police accountability and racial justice. They lobbied for reforms, pushed for new policies, and continued to demand justice for every child who had been lost to police violence. Maya Wright became a voice for her generation. She spoke at rallies, organized youth programs, and fought to keep her brother's name alive. Helena Wright, once shattered by grief, became an activist in her own right, dedicating her time to supporting other mothers who had lost children to violence. And Marcus, he never stopped fighting. They had won the battle. But the war was far from over. Final scene. One evening, Marcus stood at the grave of his son. The city was quiet now. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. He crouched down, running his fingers over the name carved into the stone. Jeremiah Wright, 2009, 2024. A son, a brother, a dreamer, a fighter. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Instead, he whispered, "They won't forget you." And as he stood, looking out at the city that had been forever changed, he made a silent promise. They would never forget Jeremiah Wright, because his name would live forever. The fight that never ends. A new battlefield. The sun had barely begun to rise over Greystone when Marcus Wright found himself staring at the courthouse steps once again. Months had passed since the trial of Officer Bradley Porter, but the echoes of that verdict had yet to fade. Now there was a new battle to fight. New laws had been proposed in the wake of the case, laws designed to hold police officers accountable, to mandate de-escalation training, to require independent investigations into police-involved shootings. But those laws weren't being passed without a fight. The Fraternal Order of Police had launched an aggressive campaign against them, branding them as anti-law enforcement and dangerous to public safety. Political leaders were being pressured to kill the bills before they even reached the floor. And in the streets, protests were still raging. The people who had chanted for justice for Jeremiah were now demanding more. And Marcus, he was preparing for the fight of his life. The pressure of power. "Dad, you need to eat something." Maya's voice was soft, but firm. She stood in the doorway of his study, arms crossed over her chest. Marcus barely looked up from the pile of legal documents in front of him. "I will. Later." "No. Now." Maya walked into the room, setting a plate down in front of him. "You've barely slept. Mom's worried about you. I'm worried about you." Marcus sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He knew she was right. He felt like he hadn't taken a real breath since the night Jeremiah was killed. Maya sat down across from him. "We already won, Dad. Porter is in prison. Why are you still pushing yourself like this?" Marcus looked at his daughter, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out a stack of papers and placed them in front of her. "These are reports of other police shootings in the past 3 months," he said. "Unarmed black men, young boys. The cases didn't even make national news." Maya picked up one of the papers. The name on it made her stomach turn. Malcolm Ross, 15 years old, shot and killed in his driveway after officers mistook his cell phone for a weapon. Another name, Andrew Phillips, 22 years old, shot after reaching for his wallet during a routine traffic stop. Maya swallowed hard. "This isn't just about Jeremiah anymore," Marcus said. It never was. Bradley Porter's fate. Inside his prison cell, Bradley Porter sat at a metal table, staring at the letter in his hands. It had arrived that morning, addressed in neat handwriting. Marcus Wright. Bradley's fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper. "Bradley, I do not forgive you. I never will. But I also refuse to let my son's death be just another statistic. What you did destroyed my family, but it also forced this country to look in the mirror. You don't deserve redemption, but you do have a choice. You can waste away in that cell, telling yourself that you were a victim of circumstance. Or you can help expose the system that protected you for so long. Either way, justice is already being served. But if you want to do something that actually matters, if you want to be part of the solution instead of the problem, then let me know." Marcus Wright. Bradley exhaled, his pulse hammering in his ears. Was this real? Did Marcus Wright actually expect him to help the same people who had put him behind bars? He closed his eyes, remembering the moment he had pulled the trigger, remembering Jeremiah's lifeless body. For months, he had tried to justify what he had done. But now, all he could do was wonder, was this his last chance to do something right? The attack. It happened on a Thursday night. The Wright family had just returned home from a community meeting when the first Molotov cocktail hit their front porch. Glass shattered. Flames exploded into the night. Maya screamed. Marcus grabbed Helena, pulling her away as the second firebomb crashed through the living room window. The heat was instant, suffocating. Smoke filled the air. Helena grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her toward the back door. Marcus turned to follow, but then he saw the shadows moving outside. Figures in dark clothing, standing in the street, watching, waiting. The police weren't coming. They had made that clear weeks ago. Marcus clenched his fists. This was the price of justice. The fallout. The attack made national headlines. Wright family home firebombed in apparent retaliation attack. Police say no leads in arson case. Threats against the Wrights continue as backlash grows. But Marcus didn't care about the headlines. He cared about his wife, his daughter. He cared about the look in Helena's eyes when she realized they weren't safe in their own home. "Marcus, we need to leave," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. He shook his head. "If we leave, they win." Helena's eyes burned with fury. "We almost died. Our daughter could have been killed. You think that's a victory?" Marcus had no answer, because for the first time since this fight began, he wasn't sure if they would survive it. A decision that would change everything. Days later, Marcus stood on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. He was no longer just a grieving father. He was the face of a movement. Before him stood reporters, activists, politicians. They were waiting to see if he would back down. But Marcus Wright had never backed down from anything in his life. So he took a breath, and he spoke. "We were attacked," he said, his voice steady. "Our home was burned. Our family was threatened. And yet, the police department, the same one that protected Bradley Porter for years, has done nothing." He paused, scanning the crowd. "This is the reality of fighting for justice in this country. You don't just risk your safety. You risk your life." His hands clenched into fists. "But let me be clear. I will not stop. I will not run. And I will not be silent." The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus continued. "We have fought for convictions. Now we fight for laws. We fight for change. And we fight for every Jeremiah Wright, every Malcolm Ross, every Andrew Phillips who never got to tell their own story." He stepped back, lifting a hand. The crowd took up the chant. "Say his name. Jeremiah Wright. The end of a beginning." Later that night, Marcus sat alone in his hotel room. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of water. His entire body was exhausted. There was a knock at the door. When he opened it, Helena stood there. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "I still think we should leave." Marcus exhaled. "I know." She stepped forward, placing a hand on his chest. "But if you're staying, then I'm staying too." He looked into her eyes, the same eyes that had watched him through every battle, every heartbreak. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. "Then we fight together." Helena nodded. Together. And outside, as the city slept, the movement continued. Because the fight for justice never truly ends.